Let's take a look at the different types of cutters that we're likely to encounter for the vertical milling machine. There's quite a variety. Let's start off with the 3/8 diameter shanks. This is referred to as the shank of the cutter. This is what we are holding in the tool holder. Whether it's a standard tool holder, a collet, a drill chuck, this is what it's gauged by, and they come in a variety of sizes from 1/4 inch, 3/8, half, 5/8, 3/4, etc., all the way up the scale. This particular cutter is a 4-flute, extra long flute length. Okay, so you can see the depth here, and I'll show you as a comparison what a standard depth looks like. Okay, you can see the two. This has about a 5/8 of an inch cutting depth along the periphery of the cutter, and this has about 1.5 inches. This is really a popular cutter if you're facing across the thick part or we have to get into a deep hole and machine down on the sides. Now let's look at the end of the cutters because we can see a difference there as well. This is what we call a 4-flute center cutting cutter. You can see that in the center the cutting edge runs clear through. We can plunge with this particular cutter. You'll see a lot of 2-flute cutters are a center cutting flute as well, so we can plunge with those. On this particular end mill, this is a non-center cutting mill. You can see the little center drilled hole in the center of it that they use when they set up and grind or sharpen this particular end mill. So this one is strictly for working with the periphery of the cutter or cutting and enlarging an existing slot. We cannot plunge with this type of an end mill. Alright, this is a 1/2 inch solid carbide ball end mill. And if we were to look at the profile of this cutter, we can see that it resembles a ball or a hemisphere. Okay, this is used for decorative cuts, cutting a slot or a flute that we want to have a radiused bottom in. Very popular cutter style, very expensive cutter in solid carbide. You want to protect your cutters when you have solid carbide around, as they're quite an investment. Don't let them get chipped or dinked. This is a 2-flute cutter, and again, if we were to look at the end of it, this is a plunging type cutter as well. And by plunging, I mean from the vertical position, we can plunge down into the material while the tool is turning and cut. This is a double-ended mill, meaning we have cutting flutes on both ends of the mill. This is a single end mill. Okay, it'll only cut on one end. You get more bang for your buck often by buying a double-ended end mill. This is a 5/8 end mill, 4-flute. We'll look at the ends of it. Center cutting or non-center cutting, you tell me. We've had a little lesson on that earlier. For those of you that guessed center cutting or plungeable mill, you guessed it right on both ends. Okay, 4-flute cutter gives us a lot of surface area when we're cutting. Good chip removal with this particular type of cutter. You'll also notice on a lot of the end mills what we call a weld-on flat. This is very important depending upon the type of tool holder that we're using. We'll show you a little bit later under tool holders where this comes into play. We've got a 3/4 inch solid carbide end mill, and you can see the gold color between the flutes here. This particular solid carbide end mill was what we call tin coated afterwards, and it's a hardening process that goes over the outside, ensuring a little bit longer cutter life. However, when the cutter gets dull and we grind through the tin coating, it's simply there for effect and to remind us how much this particular cutter cost when we purchased it originally. This is an example of a form cutter. This was a 2-flute center cutting end mill. You can see again on the close-up that we can also plunge with this type of end mill. We've had this end mill special ground for a radius in the center, and we'll show you an example of what type of profile this cuts. You can send your different cutters off to the different grinding houses and have your own form cutters done for specific applications in the shop. Important considerations in form cutters, as in this case, if we have a radius from the end of the end mill to the center of the radius. So when we plot this on a piece of material, we know how far to move the bed in the z-axis in order to center up on the radius and get this form tool to work properly for us. This is another example of a form tool. It's called a corner rounding mill. This does a lot of decorative work if we're going to profile a round, a square, or rectangular part and produce a nice radius edge. Very useful tool. Gives us a real artistic look to the finished product. Non-center cutting. This tool strictly is working around the periphery of the part to be able to cut a radius edge. And they come in different sizes. You'll see on the end mill this is a 1/4 inch radius. Okay, so that's the style. This particular one is a high-speed steel corner rounding end mill made by the folks at Keo. Another example of a special form cutter is this radius cutter, and you can see that we made it from a 3/4 inch end mill. It's got a special profile for cutting a radius baffle. This is a very delicate tool. We use this in the production of our unique triple baffle quick discharge muzzle brakes. Again, you'll see a number on the side that shows us from the bottom of the cutter to the center of the radius how many thousandths we need to move in the Z-axis in order to have this cutter and radius centered in our part. So keep those tips in mind when you're having your form cutters done. This is another specialty cutter. It's a 90-degree, we like to call it a V-block cutter. We manufacture a lot of V-blocks for tooling, fixtures, and the different accessories for the firearms industry. Again, a specialized cutter, a 2-flute cutter. We can plunge with this. It's a center cut, so if we wanted to work in the vertical mode, we can come through and plunge to a specific depth. We'll show you how to properly cut a V-block for tooling or for personal use by cutting a slot or channel first and then coming back with our form tool in order to cut that 90-degree V-block. This is an example of a Woodruff cutter. Again, a specialty cutter. This tool is used for cutting slots or keyways. There's a variety of different sizes. The folks at Keo are probably some of the largest manufacturers of specific Woodruff style cutters. Now you'll notice the number of teeth that we have on this style cutter. For those of you that are already up to speed, they require turning this particular cutter at a very slow RPM. So we would simply engage the milling machine in back gear any time that we were to use a Woodruff style cutter due to the number of cutting teeth or flutes, if you will. The normal cutters that we'll deal with in an end mill are usually 2, 3, and 4 flute, depending upon the type of material that we will be machining. Here's an example of a rather large ball end mill. Again, this was a specialty cutter that we had ground. It's a Brubaker, very good quality cutter. Center cutting. You'll see that the 4 of the 6 flutes here have been relieved on the sides, so we're only going to be plunging with the 2 in the center. So this is going to produce an 1.375" radius in whatever it is that we are machining. A very expensive cutter if you had to go out and buy it. A good tip is to, if you live in an area where there's aircraft manufacturing or large machining facilities like Rohr Industries, Boeing, etc., take the time to go through their scrap pile. When their cutters get dull, chipped, or broken, you can often buy these for literally pennies on the pound and take them over and have them reground and use them in your machine shop at a tremendous savings. They're well worth your while for doing a lot of specialty and form cutters. I've done that over the years and have acquired quite a collection of very expensive cutters if I would have to go purchase them new. This is what's called a fly cutter. Fly cutter is a very useful tool in the machine shop, especially if we're surfacing a lot of material. We've got a lathe tool bit mounted in a special holder that you can make on the lathe in the mill, and it runs in the vertical position this way, and as it turns, we're just shaving off material. It's not for removing a big bulk of material, it's simply for surfacing in one smooth pass, making a flat surface, prepping our work for secondary or third operations. Okay? Last cutter we have to look at looks more like a horizontal mill cutter. Yet this is a special horizontal mill or stub arbor that we can purchase. It's got the R8 collet profile on it. And this goes up into our spindle quill. This is a lock nut on the bottom. that we simply unscrew, and we can space or put different types of horizontal cutters in this, allowing us a little more versatility in the vertical mill by being able to cut a fluted barrel, let's say, or put different flutes in a part for aesthetic value or for cooling value. Really a handy tool to have. They're going to run you $35 or $40 out of most of the popular tooling catalogs. All right, that's a pretty good overview of a variety of cutters that you can expect to use and find in your average machine shop. But before we get started making chips, let's move on and have a look at our next principle.